Hey, it's Hannah and this is What in the World, your podcast for the stories that get people talking from the BBC World Service. Today we're talking about Venezuela and its relationship with the US. President Donald Trump is worried about drugs being trafficked into America, so he's been trying to stop the cartels, the gangs that make them, and the boats that transport them. And in the past few months, he's taken this even further. He's been bombing boats in the Caribbean that he says are carrying drugs from Venezuela. These strikes have killed many people on board. And President Trump also has accused Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro, of leading a drug cartel. Venezuela denies this and says it's got nothing to do with drugs going into the US. Now, Trump and Maduro don't get on. Maduro says that the US wants his government to collapse and he's deliberately stirring up tensions by having US military ships in the area. We're going to bring you the background on why all of this is happening, what things are like in Venezuela, and what its relationship is like with the US. To break all of this down for us, here in the studio with me is Mimi Swaby, our global affairs reporter. Hey. Hey, Hannah. So you know loads about Latin America, and obviously Venezuela's in South America. It's a pretty big country. It's about the size of Nigeria, but it has been in crisis for many years. How many people live there and how many people have left Venezuela?
So it's thought right now the population is around 28.5 million people, although having an actual census is quite difficult. That number seems to vary quite a lot depending on who you're speaking to. But one thing we know for a fact is that since Nicolas Maduro, the current leader of Venezuela, took power in 2013, more than 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country. The majority of them have relocated somewhere else in Latin America. Some have also gone to Europe, Spain, for example.
What was it that caused this crisis and what's it like for the people who are still there?
So there's been about 4 decades of economic turmoil in Venezuela. There's been mismanagement through kind of bad economic policies by the government, as well as sanctions from the US on their key exports. And this has been coupled with corruption scandals and political repression, which has really come together and formed a political, an economic and humanitarian crises. And we're seeing that now with inflation. This year, it's about 180%. So really high prices and very uncertain times when it comes to going to the supermarket and buying your daily necessities. So you've got kind of the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, kind of coupled with this political and economic persecution. We've got economic sanctions by the US on oil and gas, Venezuela's biggest exports. So day-to-day life is very hard and increasingly expensive.
So talking of all of these problems with the economy, the inflation and how difficult the cost of living is for people there, it's interesting because Venezuela is actually a very rich country when it comes to oil.
Venezuela is home to the largest oil reserves in the whole world and is very valuable. However, Venezuela doesn't really benefit as much as it could do from having such large oil reserves, firstly because it has sanctions in place on these exports. Sanctions basically limit how much oil Venezuela can export to anybody. Now, the US has imposed these sanctions. However, the US is actually, it has the kind of only really active oil company in Venezuela called Chevron. However, it is very much controlling that industry. So Venezuela can't kind of make the most of it. And this is kind of really plagued the economy. Venezuela is very rich in oil and gas and other minerals like gold and diamonds and really precious stones. So it could, if these sanctions weren't in place, if the government hadn't mismanaged the economy and if oil prices hasn't nosedived when they did, it could be a really wealthy country. But all these factors combined together mean that having so much oil and having the means to be a very wealthy country doesn't really mean a lot if you can't access it.
You mentioned that the US has massive stakes in Venezuela's crude oil trade. What has the relationship been like historically between the two countries?
So, firstly, relations between the US and Venezuela have really sharply deteriorated this year. But these frosty relations have been ongoing now for a few decades. Before Nicolas Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, came to power, Caracas and Washington largely maintained quite close economic ties and good relations. The US invested heavily in the oil sector in the early 20th century, and by the mid-1920s, the US had become the biggest market for Venezuelan oil. However, this did change when Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro's predecessor, came to power. He was a left-wing president, just like Nicolas Maduro, and he saw the start of hostilities become into play. So the US and Venezuela ties deteriorated as Venezuela strengthened its ties with China and Cuba and Iran. And Venezuela expelled US-backed NGOs and accused Washington of trying to destabilize its efforts and its kind of economy. The Chavez government really focused on social programs and trying to equally distribute wealth. And there was an attempted coup plot, basically. And this was blamed on the US. And that really laid the foundation for deep distrust by Venezuela of the US. And this only kind of was exaggerated. This only grew when Nicolas Maduro came to power in 2013. And his terms have really been plagued from the start with economic destruction, decline, corruption scandals, and then, again, worsening relationships with the US. So they've never been good. But analysts are saying the relationship right now between President Trump and Nicolas Maduro are the worst they've been in decades.
And is it mainly because of their political views? They basically represent different parts of the political spectrum.
But it does go further than that. It goes further than Maduro's policies, which kind of really focus on trying to distribute wealth and trying to nationalize lots of industries as well as kind of government sectors and things like that. Nicolas Maduro has been accused of running a drug cartel, according to the Trump administration. This cartel is called Cartel de los Soles. Now, some critics say this cartel doesn't even exist. And that is exactly what the Venezuelan government have said. They said this is all a hoax.
And President Trump doesn't actually recognize Nicolas Maduro as a democratically elected leader either.
No, he doesn't. So last year's election was seen as not free or fair by many people. And the US, alongside many other nations, don't view Nicolas Maduro as the rightful winner. It's thought that he stole the election and he declared a victory when actually the opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, won, and won by quite a lot if you look at some polls. This has, again, put kind of fuel on the fire and really heated the conversation.
I want to go back to the attacks on the boats that I mentioned. So they started in September. The Trump administration says that it's striking these boats because it alleges that they're carrying Venezuelan drugs. Tell me a bit more about the drug trade in Venezuela and what kind of problems that potentially poses for the US.
So there is definitely a flow of drugs in Venezuela, going from Venezuela to the US or to Europe. However, Venezuela plays quite a minimal part in the drug trade. You have Colombia, Peru. They are the main kind of producers of cocaine. But Venezuela will see flights, ships, kind of transport by land. And the government is aware of that. They've actually said, Maduro's government has said, that they are trying to crack down on drugs flowing through the country. However, it is not a producer of cocaine or fentanyl. And these are two drugs that the US has particularly focused on. And that has been kind of the reason that we've seen so many deadly strikes in the South Caribbean Sea as well as the Pacific Ocean. And it's interestingly, the Pacific Ocean, so the other side of South America, that is the bigger trade route. That is where we see the majority of drugs flow to, again, the US or to Europe. That South Caribbean Sea, yes, there is a small trade happening there, but nothing comparatively compared to Colombia or even going by land to Mexico. But the Trump administration has taken a very strong and aggressive approach, and they've kind of designated now two criminal groups, Tren de Aragua and the Cartel de los Soles, as foreign terrorist organizations. Mm-hmm. And that basically means and gives the US more power to undergo and do more lethal, deadly strikes.
So that's really interesting if Venezuela isn't actually responsible for the bulk of the drugs that are being pushed into the US. And as you say, that there are other boats coming on the Pacific side and of course, drugs being transported by land as well. Has any evidence of drug trafficking been found on any of the boats that were attacked?
So it's really important to say there has been no evidence given by the US for any of these strikes. And we know that more than 80 people have been killed in strikes since early September on various vessels which they say are carrying drugs. There should be a court process. That is what many kind of critics are saying, that if you think these individuals are carrying drugs, again, which you haven't shown any evidence for, they should be tried in court and are given kind of fair process. However, all the evidence has essentially been destroyed. It's been blown up in these strikes. And this hasn't gone down well with Venezuela, as you can imagine, and many of its neighbors. Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, has been very vocal in saying he doesn't support Nicolas Maduro, but he wants a peaceful negotiations. He wants peaceful transition if Nicolas Maduro is to step down from power. He doesn't see these strikes, these very deadly strikes, as the option. As they say, they could be committing war crimes.
So we know that Trump wants to see a different leader in Venezuela. There's this possibility of military intervention. The two countries just don't get along. But what do Venezuelans feel about all of this?
Yes, it's no secret that the US wants to oust Maduro from government. A new leader come in. The top American diplomat has previously called Maduro a horrible dictator. However, it's more nuanced on that in Venezuela. It now appears that the majority of Venezuelans who don't support Nicolas Maduro are actually backing a US military intervention because they see that now as the only option to remove him from power. Mm-hmm. So we've seen strikes in the sea, but there is talk now of strikes happening on land and covert operations, like undercover operations happening inside Venezuela. That is obviously a huge escalation and like a step forward to a full-blown kind of military war. However, it's also really important to note that Nicolas Maduro still has supporters. We've seen this recently, and he's held many rallies trying to kind of galvanize and unite people against this US aggression, as he calls it. And he's been singing and dancing at rallies, trying to get people to come together. And there has been reasonable turnouts. We've seen many people flood the streets of Caracas and other cities in Venezuela, showing their support for Nicolas Maduro. The Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, she has backed Mr. Trump's military intervention in Venezuela. She has wholeheartedly said, I back the strikes happening and see that kind of the greater good. She sees that as the necessary means to get to power herself. However, there are kind of different factions of the opposition party in Venezuela who aren't fully on board with the strikes. They don't see this as the ultimate way or the best way of getting Maduro to step down from power. And this is something that Maduro will not want. His kind of approach at the moment has been to hold on to power, to kind of hunker down and hope that Mr. Trump doesn't escalate this further, that he doesn't do these land strikes. As for him, it seems that there aren't any kind of safe exits anymore.
Yeah, so Nicolas Maduro is not showing any signs of stepping down, and these tensions with Donald Trump just aren't going to go away anytime soon. Mimi, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it from us, but there are lots of updates on this story on the BBC News website. And we know that loads of you speak Spanish, so do check out what BBC Mundo has written about this too. And you can check out more of our episodes wherever you get your BBC podcasts or right here on the BBC World Service YouTube channel. While you're here, drop us a like, share, subscribe, and please leave us a comment with your thoughts below. I'm Hannah. This is What in the World from the BBC World Service, and we'll see you next time.